All of the advances in the comic book industry between 1970 and 1990 pushed forward the notion of comic books as valid art and entertainment for all ages. But they also led headlong towards a major crisis. Increased consumer speculation that centered more on the monetary worth of comic books than their artistic merit caused the industry to rapidly inflate. And when this bubble burst, it would send the comics world into a downward spiral that would take over a decade to even begin recovering from. Things began innocently enough, with direct distribution creating a new market for collectors and demand for back issues. Sales of old as well as new issues went up, and the publishers, particularly Marvel, responded by printing more titles. The crossover event, wherein a story affected events in multiple different titles, and characters from one book would show up in another, gained popularity. It was often necessary for collectors to buy issues of a comic book they usually don't read in order to get the full story. Clearly, publishers were taking advantage of the fact that a wider array of their comic books were available in comic shops than previously at newsstands. This would soon lead to the unfortunate trend of comics publishers creating massive and elaborate story events solely for the purpose of selling more comics. In addition, overall demand for titles was increasing across the board, not just with the major companies. Many of the smaller publishers responded to new demand by introducing new titles onto the market. However, these were not always of the best quality, and eventually dealers began to cut back on orders for independent books, which in turn hurt the independent publishers' bottom lines. At the same time, a number of comic book distributors were failing and had to close shop, leaving some small publishers without distribution. Another factor was the distributor wars, in which the two largest comics distributors, Capital City and Diamond, set ridiculously low standards for setting up an account with them. This led to an explosion in the number of comic book retailers, but many of them either had no love for comics and just a desire to make a quick buck, or were avid fans and collectors with no business savvy. This set many businesses up for a big fall. The dubious idea of introducing gimmicks into comic books to manufacture collector's items was introduced. Comic books were issued with such enhancements as shiny foil covers and holograms, of course, at a higher cover price. The idea was that collectors would buy up the gimmicked comics as well as the non-enhanced versions. When combined with the rising popularity of hot creators, this plan worked in the short run. People began to note that comic books were experiencing a boom and secondary market resale values were on the rise. Financial speculation rather than entertainment became the motivating factor for collecting comics, and sales began to skyrocket. A milestone was reached in 1990 at Marvel, when the first issue of a new Spider-Man series, written and drawn by fan favorite Todd McFarlane, was released with various alternate covers and sold over 3 million copies. Hot on its heels was the 1991 release of X-Force #1, written and drawn by Rob Liefeld, which sold nearly 4 million copies, and a new X-Men #1, a companion book to the original 1963 series, now titled Uncanny X-Men, drawn by Jim Lee, which reportedly sold over 7 million copies. They were, of course, riddled with gimmicks. X-Force was distributed in a sealed poly bag with one of 5 different collector's cards to generate multiple sales. X-Men was released with 5 different covers, and Spider-Man had at least 3 different colored covers. The real hits began in 1988, when Marvel was purchased by a corporation called Andrews Group and put into the hands of Ron Perlman. Perlman immediately did 2 things. The first was to increase the cover price of all of Marvel's comic books. This after a 50% increase over the previous 3 years by the former owners. The second thing was vastly increasing the number of titles published. As a result, there was a direct strain on the finances of collectors who wished to buy all of Marvel's line of comic books. Not to mention that many of the titles were redundant and of less than stellar quality. Marvel's blunders with Perlman at the helm continued as ill-advised acquisitions were made, including a number of trading card and entertainment-related companies. And even more new titles were tossed out into the market, with even higher cover prices. Collectors were only able to keep up for so long. Soon, they began abandoning comic books altogether and sales dropped. The company was taken public in 1991, selling 40% of its stock on the New York Stock Exchange. The idea was to continue to expand Marvel and use the resulting profits to repay stockholders, but this just wasn't happening. There were far fewer people buying any of the existing Marvel products than before, never mind the new merchandise flooding the market. Perlman's apparent plan to make Marvel a multimedia conglomerate on par with Disney was failing fast. The fiasco continued with Marvel's 1995 purchase of Heroes World Distributing and subsequent decision to distribute all of their comic books exclusively via Heroes World. Other publishers scrambled to sign exclusive deals with either Capital City or Diamond, forcing smaller distributors out of business. Retailers now had to set up accounts with multiple distributors, so those with less experience in running a business were in way over their heads. Distribution of comic books became spotty in several parts of the nation. Adding to Marvel's woes was a declining interest in sports collectibles due to player strikes and other factors meant that the sport card companies acquired by the publisher were essentially lost capital, and a misguided repurchase of half the stock that Marvel had sold to the public sank the company even further into debt. Things degenerated so badly and so quickly that Marvel was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in December of 1996 after accumulating a debt to the tune of $700 million. The company came dangerously close to being permanently dissolved. Marvel has long been the nation's leading comic book publisher, and its dissolution would have been nothing short of cataclysmic for the entire American comics industry. Perlman, however, managed to make a few $100 million for himself by nearly destroying the company.